Well, Dottie, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And can I say that I think it's a privilege not just to be invited to speak here, but particularly to have Garret Fitzgerald in the audience. And I think Garret was one of those men who pioneered the reconciliation between Ireland and the United Kingdom at a time when that was quite a difficult furrow to plough. And I think that the friendship, the trust between the two countries today is something to which you, Garret, contributed an enormous amount, and we're grateful to you. And can I also express my appreciation for what Dottie said about David Cameron's response to the Saville report. And I read this morning when I arrived at the British Embassy in Dublin the text of the motion which the Dáil was debating and passed today, and I shall make sure that I speak to the Prime Minister when I get back to London and draw his attention to that motion. But perhaps I could use just this platform to say how much I, and I'm sure my colleagues in the British government, will have appreciated the tone and the generous spirit behind that all-party motion which the Dáil passed this morning. And I'm delighted to be here in Dublin. I've come from a very sort of positive lunch with Dick Roach. I've had a chat with Enda Kenny, and I've also, it says in the text, had a chance to meet. I think at times it felt like a good old interrogation by members of the Joint Committee on European Affairs in the Oireachtas. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to speak on Europe at this respected institute. I mean, the list of speakers that you have welcomed here in the past is remarkable. Prime ministers, presidents, leading academics and great thinkers, as well as EU commissioners and a former Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, last year, you invited the Liberal Democrat peer, Lord Wallace, former head of Chatham House, who stood here and gave a speech entitled, "Does Britain have a European policy?" Well, I'm here today to give a categorical yes in answer to that question, and I hope that after today no one in this room will be in any doubt about the coalition government's approach to Europe and what we intend to achieve. And I should add, perhaps, that I'm delighted that William Wallace is now part of the coalition government in London, serving as a whip and an occasional foreign affairs spokesman in the House of Lords. He is also, I can say, speaking as a member of the Parliament Choir, an extremely good bass. So he and I have sort of some cultural as well as political links. But in addition to outlining the British government's policy on Europe, I'd also like to touch briefly on how Britain and Ireland can work more closely together within Europe to ensure that our membership delivers the results that our electorates expect. Almost every visiting speaker from the UK is going to talk about the extensive ties which bind our two nations. I think those links, the complicated, intertwined history of our countries, is well understood. But the importance of those links, those joint interests today, should never be taken for granted. Ireland is the 5th largest export market for the United Kingdom, and we export more to Ireland than we do to the so-called BRIC countries. The UK, for its part, is Ireland's largest trading partner, with exports to the UK totalling more than those to France, Germany and Italy combined. So at a time when both of our countries are focused on trying to deliver a growth and export-led economic recovery, these economic links are vital. Ours are both open economies, attractive to inward investors looking for an educated workforce, a stable government and a business platform from which to export to the rest of Europe and beyond. And we continue to cooperate ever more closely in areas such as energy and have increasingly interconnected electricity grids to allow both the import and export of energy as needed. And the people of Ireland and the UK are linked in ways that few other countries can match. This goes well beyond the 200 direct flights a day and the countless ferry and road passengers who go back and forth on both business and pleasure. There are shared values, shared cultures, and personal and family histories which have allowed the transformation of the relationship between our two countries in recent years. I gained some first-hand experience of this during my time shadowing Northern Ireland when I came to Dublin regularly for meetings with political leaders, commentators, and business representatives here. It's a real pleasure to come back now in my new ministerial capacity. And today, I believe that the UK and Ireland can genuinely point to our having a strong and modern partnership, one which understands and acknowledges our history, including the mistakes which were made, but which does not allow the problems of the past to get in the way of cooperation for the future. I've been delighted by the recent progress in the political process in Northern Ireland. The devolution of policing and justice in April and the appointment of David Ford as the Justice Minister are significant steps towards cementing permanently the gains which have been made. And as you said in your introduction, Dorothy, the publication of the Saville report into the events of Bloody Sunday also represents a further part of the healing process as we come to terms with the difficult issues of the past. And this new relationship, coupled with the strong personal ties shared between our two countries, are going to be ever more important in a world where problems and the solutions which we seek for those problems are increasingly global in character. The new coalition government in London has brought a different and distinctive approach to British foreign policy, one which recognises just how interconnected the world has become, and which recognises too that if we are successfully to champion our country's interests, then we must engage fully and productively on the global scale. We believe that engagement with the European Union is an essential part of that global engagement. And William Hague made it clear before the general election that a new government would take an active and energetic approach to the EU. I think few would deny that we have done that from the start. From the Prime Minister down, we have been busy meeting our counterparts in Europe and holding substantive discussions on some of the serious challenges which we face. This includes, of course, the very positive and friendly meeting which took place last week in London between the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach, during which they discussed the recent European Council and how our two countries could cooperate in Europe. Now, of course, one of the most recognisably distinctive features of the new government is that it is a coalition between Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. And while coalition governments are a familiar feature for many of our European partners, including, of course, for Ireland, this is the first coalition of any sort that we've had in the United Kingdom since 1945, and the first peacetime coalition since the 1930s. And I have found, in talking in particular to Belgian and Dutch colleagues, that there's been a measure of amazement at how speedily we managed to get it going. And some people want to say that this is just down to the consciousness of the gaze of the international financial markets, but of course it had a great deal to do also with the fact that Her Majesty was firmly booked to open Parliament on a set date. The horses and the carriages were all set up, and she couldn't arrive and not find a Queen's speech waiting for her to deliver. And I think it's fair to say that many political commentators thought a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition would have a difficult time finding common ground on European policy. But the reality has turned out to be different. Despite the fact that our two parties have traditionally approached the EU from somewhat different ideological stances, it was not difficult to find agreement on the fundamentals. The coalition's programme for government contains a specific section on European policy. It commits the government to playing a leading role in an enlarged Europe and to taking specific measures to ensure future decisions on Europe reflect the will of the British public. As the Prime Minister said in Brussels after this month's EU Council meeting, there are things we can do at the European level that are important and in Britain's interests. Our trade with European partners, the access that we have to the EU's open markets, and ensuring European competitiveness are vital for future British prosperity. The coalition also agreed that the EU and its institutions already have all the competencies which it needs to deliver for member states on the big issues where the EU collectively can add value. On issues like global competitiveness, global warming, global poverty, and others, what the EU needs more than anything else is the political will to turn policy into action. So our programme for government says that there should be no further transfer of sovereignty or powers from Westminster to Brussels over the course of the next Parliament. It also commits us to introducing legislation to ensure that any proposed future treaty or treaty change which included transfers of power or competencies from the UK to the EU would be subject to a referendum, as of course is already the case here in Ireland. Now I know that it will be recognised in Dublin probably more than in any other capital in Europe that having a legal requirement for a referendum does not necessarily make life easy for governments. But we are certain that this is the right thing for the United Kingdom. We see today a democratic disconnection between the people of the United Kingdom and EU institutions and decisions taken on behalf of the British people at a European level, which we need to put right. The latest Eurobarometer results, reflecting polling data collected during 2009, show that only 23% of the British public were prepared to say that they trusted the EU, and only 36% thought that UK membership was a good thing. The legitimacy of the European Union ultimately derives from the people who live in its member states, and giving those people a direct say on any future transfer of power from the United Kingdom to European institutions is therefore essential to ensure the long-term legitimacy of the European Union. Similarly, it is important that the EU focuses only on those areas where cooperation at European level genuinely can add value and dispenses with activities best left to member states. Doing that effectively and consistently would do a considerable amount to reassure people that the EU can be responsive to their concerns and that it doesn't seek to interfere in every corner of national life. I believe it is hard, for instance, to argue that there need to be European-level regulations over the hours that doctors work in each member state. Such regulation discredits Europe when it has an adverse effect on public services, in this case patient care. But as important as these issues are, the most immediate and pressing area for the EU to focus on at the moment is, of course, the economy. If the economies of Europe are to thrive and prosper in future, we must ensure that they remain competitive and open for business. If we look at the past 10 years, China's growth has averaged 9.9%, with India's not far behind at 7%. During that same decade, growth in the European Union averaged just 1.7%. These are IMF figures. And we can't just shrug our shoulders and accept that level of disparity. Europe has huge advantages. Some of the world's most highly skilled workers, operating for the most technologically advanced companies within the world's largest single market. We need to build on these advantages to promote growth and remain competitive. And the first thing that European governments have to do, yes, is to take steps to reduce national benefits. Like Ireland, the United Kingdom has now embarked on a sustained programme of deficit reduction as part of a wider programme of national economic reform. The emergency budget, which George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced on the 22nd of June, outlined the measures we will take to achieve this. Those are going to be difficult measures that will require very tough decisions on both spending and taxation. But they are necessary to deliver the growth and the jobs that are vital for the future economic well-being of the country. Different governments across Europe are taking their own measures to ensure their national economies too are fit for the future. But I believe there are also steps that the European Union as a whole needs to take. For if I look at the world, if I look beyond the immediate financial and debt crisis, what worries me most is the erosion of European competitiveness compared with the Far East or Latin America or parts of the Gulf. And I fear that if we fail to reverse that erosion of our competitive position, then we are going to condemn future generations to lower living standards, perhaps absolutely, as well as relative to those emerging economies. So what should the EU do? First, the countries of Europe working together should act to promote growth and jobs. And we believe that strengthening the single market is the best way to achieve this, and we will therefore push for its extension. We're going to push for better regulation to lighten the burdens on business and break down the barriers for commerce in Europe, and for the EU to seize every opportunity to create freer and fairer trade between the European Union and third countries. Free trade has been one of the great successes of the European Union, and there are further benefits still to be won. Within the single market, we can see real opportunities to boost growth by opening up further the energy and services sectors, by developing a single market of the digital economy, and by moving forward on patents in a way that makes a positive difference to European business. Mario Monti's recent report on relaunching the single market contained many good proposals, and we should look to build on these. Much of the EU's future growth is likely to be found in trade with the emerging economies around the world. So the British government is going to work to encourage greater economic and political engagement between the EU and the world's rising economic and political powers. Many of these ideas are contained in the new Europe 2020 strategy for economic growth that was agreed by EU heads of state at this month's European Council. It's a strategy that rightly focuses on jobs, on smart and sustainable inclusive growth by boosting competitiveness, on productivity and on growth potential. Europe 2020 focuses on many of the right priorities. But if we're honest with ourselves, we will also admit that we've seen European strategies come and go in the past with far too few concrete results. And it's vital that we make sure that this one actually delivers. If we want our peoples to have more confidence in the European Union, we have to be able to show them that Europe is making a difference for the good on those matters which matter most to ordinary families. And at the moment, that means jobs and living standards above everything else. For the sake of both the British and the Irish economy, we can't simply afford to see Europe 2020 sort of languish on the Commission's websites as some aspirational document that never actually leads anywhere. Now, as we all know, the most pressing and immediate issue facing the European Union is the crisis in the Eurozone. And I should sort of spell out very clearly where the British government is coming from on this. Now, we have no plans to join the euro. That is set out in the coalition document very clearly. And to be honest with you, I think even if the British government were to change its mind on that, which it won't, we're so far from meeting the convergence criteria that it's an academic question for the most part anyway in the short term. But we want the Eurozone to do well. Its members are some of our closest friends and allies. Britain has chosen to stay out of the euro, but we recognise that it is important for our national interest for the Eurozone to be strong and successful. 40% of British exports go to countries which use the euro. And it's clearly in our interest to support efforts to make the Eurozone more stable and more capable of dealing with the difficulties it faces. More broadly, we know that the EU is at its best when it delivers tangible economic benefits to its citizens. The EU must capitalise on its position as the world's largest multilateral trading bloc. As a trading area, the EU is larger than the US and Japan combined, and we need to take full advantage of the opportunities this brings for both European businesses and European consumers. So, we're clear that the countries of the EU should act to ensure that the Union is economically stable and prosperous. That is right in itself, but it is also necessary because it will be through our economic strength that we will be able to retain and build upon our global influence. The EU, when it comes together in the right way, can be a powerful voice in deciding how the world tackles global problems like climate change, the scourge of poverty, or nuclear proliferation. Now, it's crucial for our collective interests that the EU's member states have some say on issues as important as these. The British government simply does not accept that the rise of emerging powers like China and India means that European nations must accept a corresponding drop in their own global influence. Our common interest is served when the nations of the EU use their collective weight in the world to promote our shared interests and shared values. But to achieve this is going to take a greater determination and a greater consistency of effort over the delivery of our foreign policy goals than we have previously shown. We want EU member states to show leadership in tackling international climate change. Britain therefore supports an increase in the EU's emissions reduction targets from 20 to 30% without waiting for comparable offers from other countries. The EU can show leadership globally by making progress on delivering climate finance to developing countries, by coordinating our outreach to the emerging economies, and by accelerating the transition to a low-carbon economy. Taking that action now is in our interests because it will put us in the position to take full advantage of the new green jobs and green growth that are being developed, as well as promoting both energy security for Europe and a sustained economic recovery. In addition, EU member states must continue to work to find common ground on other important issues, as we did on Iran at the European Council meeting last week. In London, we were pleased with the strong, unequivocal declaration on Iran that was issued then. The Iranian nuclear programme is a challenge to every member of the European Union, and an issue on which the nations of Europe have a strong shared interest. It's important that the EU is able to show that it can deliver results. We want to see a diplomatic solution to Iran's nuclear programme. But part of that must mean that we should not equivocate if the time comes for the EU to introduce further sanctions. On development, we will press to see the EU as a whole meet its commitment to deliver 0.7% of GDP in international development assistance by 2015. Even in difficult times for us, we should be resolute about supporting countries in which being poor is actually life-threatening rather than just about the quality of life. And on our own doorsteps, the EU must not lose sight of the enormous benefits that our enlargement policy has brought and can bring in the future. enlargement has been a remarkable achievement for the European Union. Europe has never been as free or as stable as it is today. The policy of enlargement has spread democracy and good governance across Europe. It has shown the EU at its best. If you want to single out one historic achievement of the European Union, it has been to entrench plural democracy, the rule of law, and stable government in the Iberian Peninsula, in Greece, and in Central and Eastern Europe. Countries which, between the First and Second World Wars, all succumbed to dictatorship, some of which suffered the agony of civil war. We believe that there are more benefits to be gained by further enlargement, including to Turkey and to the countries of the Western Balkans, as those countries strive for and eventually meet the criteria for membership. The prospect of EU membership remains a uniquely powerful force for good in the Western Balkans, a region which is still scarred by the conflicts of the 1990s. There is a delicate political stability now in place, but it is not firmly embedded, as I saw for myself when I was in Kosovo and Macedonia last week. We see the prospect of EU and indeed also of NATO membership as an unparalleled opportunity to further ensure stability and to enhance prosperity. Now, the difficult steps towards meeting the conditions set by the EU are going to require real political leadership from all the countries of the region. At the same time, I believe that the international community needs to sharpen its focus on the Western Balkans, taking an active, determined, and results-focused approach. How the EU responds to the often complicated issues in the Balkans will be a defining measure of the EU's ability and willingness to be a force for good in the world. If we want people to regard any talk about a common European foreign and security policy as something that is meaningful, then we have to demonstrate in the Western Balkans that those are words which we are prepared to translate into vigorous and determined diplomatic and political action. Similarly, the British government is clear about the benefits of Turkey's continued progress towards membership. These are benefits not just for Turkey as it moves towards meeting membership criteria, but for all existing members of the Union who would gain from having Turkish economic dynamism. This is going to be one of the big emerging economies in the 21st century world, and Turkey's geopolitical outreach within the EU. And I've covered a wide range of issues today, and I wish I had time to go into those matters in greater detail. But I wanted to sketch for you the range of issues upon which the government I represent is focusing to illustrate the active and activist approach which the Cameron government is taking towards Europe. I know that my country and Ireland approach many of these issues from a similar perspective. And I know that as our bilateral relationship has been transformed over the past generation, there is also a huge amount to be gained by promoting our common interests and shared values. On immediate practical policy issues like financial services reform and better regulation, the visions in London and Dublin are very closely aligned. There is a great deal more we can do to cooperate together on energy and climate change, and by working to promote the use of renewable resources across these islands. So I would like the United Kingdom and Ireland to cooperate further in developing our shared outlook towards the European Union, to make the EU collectively and our membership of the EU a success. In particular, I want us to see how we can together make sure that the European Union's priority is growth and job creation, and that the vital work in this area delivers real results to our peoples. So, Dorothy, can I thank the Institute once again for welcoming me here today. I'm very happy to take any questions that you wish to ask.